Constantine is the man everyone blames. On the 7th of March, in the year 321, he signed a law telling judges and tradesmen to rest on the venerable day of the sun, Sunday. That document is the entire case. Read it. It never says Sabbath, it never says Christian, and it lets farmers work. Nobody changed the Sabbath to Sunday. What the first Christians actually did was keep both days and work straight through one of them. Neither side of this argument will tell you that. Almost nobody quoting that law has read past the first line. The text survives in the Codex Justinianus, gathered up 2 centuries later by lawyers who preserved the emperor's rulings. Constantine at that point still held the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Roman religion, and running the festival calendar was part of the job description. The Latin phrase is Venerabili Dei Solis, the venerable day of the sun, not Dies Dominica, the Lord's Day, which was already the ordinary Latin term among Christians. The day of the sun. Judges were to stop, townspeople were to stop, workshops were to close. Then comes the exception, and the exception is everything. People in the countryside may freely attend to the fields, because no other day may be so well suited to putting grain in the furrow or vines in the trench. 4 months later, in July of the same year, he issued a second ruling about the same day, permitting the legal freeing of slaves on it and calling it a festival day. Put the 2 laws side by side, and you have a Roman holiday regulation. Courts shut, shops shut, cities quiet, farms exempt, because sowing will not wait on a calendar. Now hold that exemption up against the commandment it supposedly replaced. Exodus 34 verse 21 goes out of its way to name the 2 moments in the year when a farmer would most want an exception. Ploughing time and harvest, even then it says, you stop. So the emperor's law does the precise opposite of the commandment at the precise point where the commandment is most demanding. It carves out the one group Sinai refuses to carve out. Whatever Constantine was doing in 321, he was not transferring the Sabbath. He was doing something, just not that. And to see what, you have to go back 250 years to a province where nobody had a day off at all. The first followers of Jesus were Jews, and they kept the 7th day the way they kept their own names. The Sabbath was not a doctrine to them. It was the shape of the week. Luke's pattern in Acts is not subtle. Paul walks into a synagogue on the Sabbath and argues from the scriptures. Salamis, Pisidian Antioch, Thessalonica, Corinth. Luke reports it as routine, the ordinary rhythm of a Jewish teacher, not as a concession to people he was trying to win. Alongside that, there are 2 references to the first day of the week. Acts 20 verse 7 describes a meeting at Troas to break bread on the first day, which ran past midnight because Paul was leaving in the morning. 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2 tells each believer to set something aside on the first day of every week, so that no collection has to be made when Paul arrives. Be honest about how thin that is. 1 farewell meeting and 1 instruction about household saving, which may not describe an assembly at all. If you were taught that the Apostolic Church clearly and universally moved its worship to Sunday, and that the Bible plainly says so, you were handed a load the text cannot carry. Sunday-keeping Christians overreach here, and I want to be exact about it rather than polite. The strongest early evidence for a first-day gathering is not in Scripture. It comes from a Roman civil servant who found the practice inconvenient. Pliny the Younger governed Bithynia and Pontus from around 111 to 113. He interrogated Christians, executed some, and then wrote to the Emperor Trajan because he was not certain the law was on his side. His letter is the earliest outside account of Christian worship we possess. The Christians told him, he says, that the whole of their offense amounted to this. They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn, to sing responsibly to Christ as to a god, and to bind themselves by oath against theft, fraud, and adultery. Later in the day they gathered again to eat ordinary food. Before dawn, not at dawn. Before it, nobody meets in the dark for the pleasure of it. They met before dawn because the hours that followed were working hours. Roman Bithynia had no weekend. The slave went to the mill, the tanner went to the vats, the dockhand went to the harbour. Economically, the fixed day was a Tuesday. Here is my first strong claim in this video, and I hold it firmly. That single detail is the most underused fact in the entire Sabbath argument, and it belongs to neither camp because neither camp finds it convenient. Whatever the fixed day was to the first Christians, it was not a day of rest. It was a day they got up early to steal an hour from. Which brings us to a word, and to the reason the word decides more than the councils do. The Hebrew noun Shabbat comes from the verb shavat, not to worship, not to gather, not even in its root sense to relax. Shavat means to cease, to desist, to stop doing a thing you were doing, Genesis 2, verse 2-3 says that on the seventh day God shavat from all his work, not because he was tired. Isaiah 40, verse 28 insists the Creator does not grow weary or faint. He stopped. The natural opposite of shavat is not work. The natural opposite is start, and look at what the fourth commandment actually contains. Exodus 20, verse 8-11 says nothing about assembling, nothing about a service, nothing about worship. The command is to cease, and it widens outward in circles. You, your son and daughter, your servant, your animal, the foreigner inside your gate. A law about stopping, and about the people whose stopping depends on you. That gives us a test, and the test settles more than most of this argument ever gets around to. A Sabbath is not a day you attend, it is a day you cease. By that test, the Sunday of the first Christians was not a Sabbath. Not because a bishop ruled it so, because they were back at work by the third hour. Now cross over into the Greek, where a second word does quieter but equally serious damage. The phrase, the Lord's Day, occurs exactly once in the Christian scriptures. Revelation 1 verse 10, in Greek, Kuriake hemera. John says he was in the Spirit on the Kuriake hemera when he heard the voice like a trumpet behind him. Kuriakos is an adjective, and its ordinary use in the Greek-speaking East was administrative. It meant belonging to the Lord, belonging to the Master, and in practice it meant imperial. Imperial property, imperial revenue, the things that belong to the man who owns everything. Paul is the only other writer in the Christian scriptures to use it, in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 20, of the Kuriakon Deipnon, the Lord's Supper. Two occurrences in the whole collection, and both of them attach the emperor's adjective to a crucified Galilean. So when a Greek-speaking subject of Domitian heard the phrase, he heard a word normally reserved for Caesar's things, transferred without apology to somebody else's. Now the honest caveat, because this verse gets swung around like a hammer. Some careful scholars argue that Revelation 1 verse 10 does not mean a weekday at all, but the eschatological day of the Lord, the day of judgment that the prophets announce and that Revelation spends 22 chapters describing. A serious reading, and I will not pretend otherwise. The strongest counterpoint is grammatical. Elsewhere that eschatological day is hemera kyrio, a different construction. And the adjective kuriake goes on to become the standard Greek word for Sunday. It still is. Ask a Greek speaker today what kyriaki means, and they will tell you the first day of the week. My own reading is that the weekly sense is more probable. But it is a probability, not a proof, and anyone who tells you this verse closes the case is selling you something. The 2nd century is where the trail thickens, and where 3 names get quoted constantly by people who have never checked them. Ignatius of Antioch was arrested and taken to Rome to die, writing letters to churches as he went. The traditional date is around 108. Some scholars argue for the 130s or 40s. In his letter to the Magnesians, chapter 9, he writes about people raised in the old ways who came into a new hope, no longer sabbatizing but living according to the Lord's something. The something is the problem. The only surviving Greek manuscript, the Codex Mediceo Laurentianus, reads katakariakon zoon zontes, living according to the Lord's life. A medieval Latin translation preserves a shorter reading without the word life, which allows the standard rendering, living according to the Lord's day. Then there is a third witness, and it is the most telling one. An expanded version of this letter, produced by a later editor around the 3rd century, rewrites the passage to make Sunday explicit, and adds a swipe at Jewish idleness. Somebody, centuries after Ignatius, thought the original was not clear enough and fixed it. My position is that the Sunday reading is probably right, because Ignatius is contrasting sabbatizing with something. And a manner of life is a strange thing to set against a weekly practice. But that is a lean, not a proof. Tract after tract cites it as a proof, and it should not be. The Epistle of Barnabas, written somewhere between 70 and 135, gives us the first clear statement of an 8th-day observance. The author says, the present Sabbaths are not acceptable, that God will make a beginning of an 8th day which is the beginning of another world, and that this is why they keep the 8th day with gladness, the day Jesus rose. But follow the argument he is actually making. Barnabas is talking about an eschatological rest, a world to come, a Sabbath God has not yet given. He is not proposing a substitute rest day. He is proposing a symbol. Then, Justin Martyr, and this is the one that matters most. Around 155, Justin wrote a defense of Christianity addressed to the Emperor Antoninus Pius. In chapter 67 of that first defense, he gives us the fullest description of Christian worship anywhere in the 2nd century. On the day called Sunday, he writes, Everyone living in the towns and in the countryside gathers in one place. The memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read for as long as time allows. The president speaks, urging the imitation of what has been read. All stand and pray. Bread and wine and water are brought. Those who are able give what they wish, and the collection goes to orphans, widows, the sick, prisoners, and strangers. He even explains why the day was chosen. The first day, he says, is when God brought the world out of darkness, and the day on which Jesus rose. Now notice the hole in the middle of it. There is no cessation, no rest, no refusal of labor, nothing about work at all. Justin is writing a legal brief to a Roman emperor. His entire purpose is to describe everything Christians do so as to prove they are harmless. If Christians had been refusing to work one day in 7, in a slave economy, that is a socially visible and economically disruptive practice, and it belonged in that document. It is not there. I think Justin's silence is the loudest silence in this entire debate, and I have never seen a satisfying answer to it from the Sunday as Sabbath side. The Swiss scholar Willi Rohrdorf, whose study of Sunday appeared in German in 1962 and in English 6 years later, put it about as bluntly as a historian can. Down to the 4th century, the idea of rest played essentially no part in the Christian Sunday. People have argued with Rohrdorf about plenty. On that specific point, he is very hard to answer, so stand back and count what we have. Object 1. A weekly assembly on the first day, rooted in an empty tomb, attested by a hostile Roman governor before 113, described in detail by the 150s, held before dawn or after dark around a working day. Object 2. A commandment to cease, given at Sinai, fixed to the 7th day, older than the Church by more than 1,000 years, and defined by a verb that means stop. 2 objects, different origins, different purposes, different days, no overlap. Here is the image I want you to carry through the rest of this. A gardener takes a cutting from one tree and binds it into the trunk of another. In the first seasons you can see everything: the wrapping, the wound, the mismatch in the bark. Come back in 10 years and the bark has closed over the join. Come back in 100 and a visitor would swear the whole tree grew that way from seed. Sunday is the trunk. It has its own root, and that root is the resurrection. Sabbath rest is the cutting. Older, cut from another tree and bound on by somebody's hand. Everything that follows is the story of the graft, and the remarkable thing is that we can watch it being tied. Around 363, roughly 30 bishops met at Laodicea, in Phrygia, in what is now Western Turkey, a regional synod, not an ecumenical council. Most of its 60 canons deal with church discipline: who may go to the altar, who may bathe with whom, which books may be read aloud. Canon 29 is the one that gets quoted. Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, honoring the Lord's Day instead, and if they can, resting then as Christians. Anyone found Judaizing is to be anathema from Christ. That canon is presented constantly as the moment the Sabbath was abolished. Look at what it assumes. You do not legislate against a practice nobody has. Nobody nails up a notice forbidding swimming in a desert. The canon commands Christians to work on Saturday, which tells you that in the churches of Phrygia, in the 360s, Christians were not working on Saturday. 3 centuries after the crucifixion, the church in Asia Minor had to threaten excommunication to stop believers resting on the 7th day. Nothing about that looks like the residue of a settled apostolic change. That is a change still being fought badly in the 4th century. Then look at the second half of the same sentence. Rest on the Lord's Day if you can. Conditional, permissive, a preference dressed as an alternative. This is one of the earliest moments the Church attaches rest to Sunday at all, and it does so tentatively, as a substitute for a habit it is trying to break. That is the graft going on. You can still see the wrapping. And here is a correction that cuts both ways, because this channel does not get to keep bad arguments just because they land well. A widely circulated Catholic catechism from the early 20th century answers the question, why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday, by saying that the Church at the Council of Laodicea transferred the solemnity. Adventist writers quote that line as a confession. Catholic apologists have quoted it as authority. It is wrong twice. Some printings date the council to 336, the synod met around 363. And Laodicea transferred nothing whatsoever. It forbade one practice and suggested another. If your case depends on that catechism sentence, your case depends on an error, and you should retire it whichever side you are arguing from. Now jump forward 80 years, to 2 historians working in Constantinople who were not trying to prove anything about days. Socrates Scholasticus, writing his church history around 440, is comparing the customs of different regions. He notes that fasting practice varies wildly, that nobody can produce a written apostolic command about it, and that the apostles evidently left such things to individual freedom. Then he adds a line about assemblies. Almost all the churches throughout the world, he writes, celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week. Yet the Christians of Alexandria and of Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this. Read that slowly. Almost all churches, on the Sabbath, every week, in the 5th century. Sozomen, writing in the same city at roughly the same time, says the same thing from the other direction. The people of Constantinople, and almost everywhere, assemble on the Sabbath as well as on the first day of the week, a custom never observed at Rome or at Alexandria. A small correction, since anyone checking sources will hit it. That second sentence is Sozomen's, from Book 7 of his history, and is attributed to Socrates constantly, including in books that ought to know better. If you're going to build an argument on a sentence, get the author right. Put the two historians together and the picture is not ambiguous. 400 years after the resurrection, most of the Christian world was gathering on both days, Saturday and Sunday. No swap, an addition, and the exceptions are the tell, Rome and Alexandria, the two great centers where the church's hostility to the synagogue ran hottest, and where the pressure to look nothing like a Jew was fiercest. Which brings me to the part of this history that ought to make every tradition uncomfortable, mine included. The Sabbath did not fall in Christianity because a council outvoted it. Centuries of steady pressure wore it down, driven by the Church's long and often vicious project of defining itself against the Jews. Ignatius sets living as a Christian against Sabbathizing. Barnabas declares the present Sabbaths unacceptable. Laodicea turns Judaize into a slur and hangs an anathema on it, and the canons around it in the same document forbid Christians to take festival gifts from Jews, to keep feasts with them, to marry them. That is the engine. Not Mithras, not a pope with a pen, not one emperor on one morning in March. A slow, sustained, ugly separation, in which a practice became suspect for the sole reason that it was shared with the synagogue. I find that a far less satisfying villain than Constantine. I also think it is the true one, and I think it is considerably more disturbing because it was not imposed on the Church from outside. It grew inside. 2 more centuries pass, and the graft still has not taken. Caesarius of Arles was bishop in southern Gaul from around 502 until his death in 542. He was a serious pastor and an energetic preacher, and he taught his people that the whole glory of the Jewish Sabbath had been transferred to Sunday, and that they should keep it accordingly. He was pushing, which tells you it was not yet normal. The response is one of the most revealing documents in this entire history, and outside specialist literature almost nobody has read it. The Third Council of Orleans met in 538. Its canon 29 records that an opinion is spreading among the people, that on Sunday it is wrong to ride, or to drive, or to cook food, or to do work about the house or the person. The bishops rule that such opinions are more Jewish than Christian, and that what has been lawful up to now shall remain lawful. 538, 2 centuries after Constantine's law, 5 centuries after the crucifixion. A council of the Western Church ruling that treating Sunday like a Sabbath is a Jewish error. Then the same canon adds a recommendation, and the reason it gives is the whole story in miniature. Agricultural work ought to be set aside so that people are not prevented from getting to church. Attendance, not holiness, not the 4th commandment. The logic is still the logic of an assembly, not a cessation. And notice which work they name. Farm work, the exact category Constantine had exempted. 200 years later, the Church quietly closes the gap the emperor left, and it closes it for the sake of the service rather than for the sake of the commandment. From the 8th century the rules tighten in earnest. Local councils begin forbidding servile work, public buying and selling, pleading in the courts, the swearing of oaths. The bark is starting to close over the join. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, supplies the theological hinge that makes the whole thing hold. In the Summa, he splits the 4th commandment in 2. Moral, he says, insofar as it commands that some time be given to God, and that obligation is written into human nature and binds forever. Ceremonial, insofar as it fixes which time, and that part belonged to the Old Covenant. Keep the commandment, change the day, and the authority to say which day now sits with the Church. That distinction is the joint on which the entire medieval and Reformation settlement swings, and both Catholics and Protestants are standing on it whether they know it or not. The Reformers inherited it and quarrelled about it. Luther, in the Large Catechism of 1529, treated the Sabbath as an external Jewish ordinance from which Christians are free, with the day itself a matter of good order rather than divine command. Calvin allowed a creation ordinance underneath, while holding that the ceremonial part was abolished in Christ. Neither of them taught what most church-going Protestants today assume has always been believed. That teaching arrives late, and it arrives in England. In 1595, a country parson in Suffolk, named Nicholas Bound, published a book on the Sabbath, worked up from sermons he had preached about 9 years earlier. Bound argued that the fourth commandment binds Christians morally, that the day has been changed to the first, and that the entire 24 hours belong to God. No work, no market, no sport, no recreation. It set off the first Sabbatarian controversy in England, and it did more than any other single book to make the strict Sunday a badge of Puritan identity. Half a century later, the Westminster Confession wrote it into a creed. God appointed one day in 7 for a Sabbath. From the beginning of the world to the resurrection, it was the last day of the week. From the resurrection, it was changed to the first, which Scripture calls the Lord's Day, and it is to be continued to the end of the world as the Christian Sabbath. There is the graft, fully healed, described as though the tree had always grown that way from seed. And here is the fact I have the hardest time getting people to sit still for. The doctrine that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, the version most Sunday-keeping Protestants assume is apostolic, reached its finished form in a book published 16 years before the King James Bible. It is not ancient. It is early modern. It postdates the printing press by a century and a half. So, who changed the Sabbath to Sunday? Not the apostles. They left no command on the subject, and the 2 first-day passages in their writings will not carry the weight stacked on them. Constantine did not. His law shut the courts. It did not open the churches. It exempted the farmers whom Sinai refuses to exempt, named no Christian, mentioned no Sabbath, and spoke the language of the sun. Laodicea did not. It transferred nothing, and its own canon proves that Christians in Asia Minor were still resting on the 7th day when the bishops wrote it. And no single pope did it either, on any single day by any single decree. There is no such document. People have looked very hard for a very long time, precisely because finding one would end the argument. What happened instead was a sequence, and it took 1600 years to finish, 1st century. A gathering on the first day folded into a working week, rooted in an empty tomb, 2nd century. A deliberate separation from the synagogue, in which keeping the 7th day begins to mark you as belonging to the wrong people, 4th century. An emperor makes the first day a civil holiday for reasons of his own, while a regional council anathematizes Saturday rest and tentatively floats Sunday rest as a replacement, 6th century. Bishops in Gaul are still ruling that treating Sunday as a Sabbath is a Jewish error, even as they close the farmwork gap for the sake of attendance, 13th century. A theologian supplies the distinction that lets the commandment survive the change of day, 16th and 17th centuries. Puritan England welds the 4th commandment onto Sunday and writes the weld into a confession of faith. No villain, no moment. A cutting bound on in the 4th century, healed over by the 17th. Which means both of the loud answers are wrong, and I want to be even-handed about how. The 7th-day case deserves better treatment than it usually gets from Sunday-keeping pastors. They are right that the Christian scriptures nowhere command the change. Right that the fathers' arguments were driven as much by contempt for Jews as by exegesis. Right that the rest day element arrived astonishingly late. Anyone who has actually read Justin and Orleans knows this. Where that case collapses is the single villain story. The decree, the emperor, the moment of betrayal. That moment does not exist, and building a doctrine on a moment that does not exist weakens an argument that never needed it. The Sunday case deserves fairness too. The first-day assembly is early, it is widespread, and it plainly grows out of the resurrection rather than out of sun worship. Nobody had to invent it in the 4th century. Pliny found it running in Bithynia before a single church father wrote a line about it. Where that case collapses is one word: Sabbath. Calling Sunday a Sabbath imports a commandment the earliest Christians visibly did not apply to it, and then claims apostolic authority for what is, in its developed form, a Puritan construction. Now step back as far as it is possible to step. In the opening pages of Genesis, before there is a temple, before there is a priest, before there is a nation or a law or an altar or a single sacrifice, God declares one thing holy, not a place, not an object, not a person, a block of time. The first holy thing in Scripture is a day, and what makes it holy is not what happens on it. Nothing happens on it. That is the entire point. God finished and God stopped. 16 centuries of Christians then argued about which square on the calendar inherited that holiness, and in the arguing very nearly lost the word underneath it, shavat, stop. The letter to the Hebrews says there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and that whoever has entered it has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Not relocated his works to a different day of the week. Ceased. Nobody changed the Sabbath to Sunday. The first Christians kept both days and worked straight through one of them. The day they gathered and the day they rested were two different things, born 1,000 years apart. And somewhere between the 4th century and the 17th they were grafted into one tree so cleanly that the join disappeared under the bark. You can spend a lifetime arguing about which day the graft ought to sit on. Or you can ask the harder question, the one the commandment asked first and that no council has ever answered on anyone's behalf. When did you last actually stop? If you were taught one version of this story, that Constantine did it, or that the apostles did it, or that Rome did it, I would like to know which version and where you got it. Tell me in the comments. And go and read the documents before you take my word for any of this, including the parts you liked. They are short. Constantine's law is 1 paragraph, Canon 29 of Laodicea is 2 sentences, Canon 29 of Orleans is 3. I have put them, with the rest of the sources, in the description.